State Affairs Committee. Before we get started, I think we have a bill introduction from Senator Schallenberger. Senator?
Is that on? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a request for a bill introduction. Revisor number is 2797. It deals with building a lake.
Building a lake. Committee, any questions?
We need more water.
We always like water in Kansas. Committee, any questions or objections to introduction to this bill? Seeing none, that's introduced. Thank you, Senator. Any other bill introductions? Scott Schneider here.
Mr. Chair, I'm Scott Schneider here on behalf of the Kansas Craft Brewers Guild. Would like to introduce RS 2455, and it would allow microbreweries some additional rights to distribute.
All right. Committee, any questions or objections to the introduction of that bill? Seeing none, that's introduced.
Thank you.
Are there any other bill introductions? Seeing none, we're going to open our hearing on Senate Bill 368. And committee, this is on ranked choice voting. I'm going to do this like I did the previous hearings. We'll have 15 minutes for the proponents, 15 minutes for the opponents, and also give a little time for the neutral oral, and about 5 minutes or so for questions after each of those periods. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Jason Long, our revisor, to give us a bill overview on Senate Bill 368. Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 368 would prohibit the use of any form of ranked choice voting method for determining the results of any election or the nomination of candidates in any federal, state, county, or other municipal election. Ranked choice voting is a form of voting that allows voters to rank two or more candidates for an elected office in an order of preference, and then tabulates the ballots through a series of multiple rounds with the elimination of the lowest vote receiving candidate after each round until there's a candidate who has received a majority of the votes cast. That's how it's defined under the bill and generally understood in practice. Senate Bill 368 would prohibit those forms of elections in this state. Current law does not provide for ranked choice voting methods for either primary or general elections. However, with the non-uniformity of some election laws, there is argument that some municipalities may be able to charter out of state election provisions and allow for ranked choice voting in their local municipal elections. So Senate Bill 368 would provide a uniform act prohibiting such use. It also nullifies any local ordinances, resolutions, or regulations that were adopted prior to July 1st of 2024 that may be prohibited by the bill. If enacted, it would become effective on July 1st of this year, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jason. Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, do we have any of this rank voting going on now in the state of Kansas?
I have no knowledge of any municipal elections that use ranked choice voting, but I'm going to defer to the folks who run elections in our state and see if they have any knowledge.
Would you like that, I don't know, if Clay or Whitney, anybody want to step up to that? Clay, very quickly. And we do have neutral testimony from Clay and the Secretary of State. So go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No entity in Kansas uses ranked choice voting. And the counties run elections. They don't even have the infrastructure to carry it out, so none do.
Okay, thank you. Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if this question's for Jason. Maybe Clay could answer also. Now, this would not affect any party special elections that would select a candidate for approval by the governor, because I know I was elected to the House in a special election of precinct committee men and women, and they do use a ranked choice voting method. Any candidate not receiving more than half of the voting delegation, it would go to another round. So you must have a candidate, like if you, for example, if you had a candidate or 3 candidates in a race and there were 90 votes possible, you would need 46 votes to win that election. Otherwise, it would go to a second round. They would eliminate the lowest receiving vote candidate, and then the next 2 would be voted in the next round. And I've seen this happen many times, but this bill would not affect any of those party special elections, correct?
The bill does not address those particular precinct elections, committee elections to fill a vacancy. I would defer to the Secretary of State's office as to their interpretation as to the scope of the bill and whether or not those types of selections would be covered under the bill or not. And maybe he can cover that in his testimony.
I think we'll do that when we get to the neutral. I'll open up for questions for the Secretary of State's office. Senator Blasey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, Senator Stroud, what you're describing is a runoff. You know, there was an election, they counted all the votes publicly, and then they eliminated the bottom person, so they did it again. Ranked choice, where you have a ballot, and you're listing each round how you want to rank people. Whereas you're only casting 1 ballot for 1 person each round, whereas you're not ranking them.
There's a difference, yes. Any other questions for Jason? Seeing none, thank you, Jason. All righty, committee, we're going to start off with our oral proponents. We have Madeline Melissa, who's a visiting fellow from Opportunity Solutions Project. Madeline's on WebEx. Madeline, again, we're going to do a 15-minute block. Doesn't mean you have to take the entire 15 minutes. Also leave some time for your for another proponent on there. So, Madeline, are you online?
I sure am. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and the clock starts now.
Sounds good. Good morning, Chair Thompson, Vice Chair Clues, and honorable members of the committee. My name is Madeline. I'm a visiting fellow at the Opportunity Solutions Project. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we are dedicated to promoting policies that help more people achieve the American dream. And I really appreciate the opportunity to testify here. Thank you to the committee for allowing me to testify via Zoom. I'm due with a baby next week, so unfortunately unable to travel. Otherwise, I would certainly be there in person. And thank you to Senator Blasey, the sponsor, for making this bill a priority this session. I want to tell you the reason that I'm here. So I'm a lawyer and a public policy expert, but I also vote in ranked choice voting elections. Maine and Alaska are the only 2 states that use this system. It was passed by slim majorities on ballot initiatives. And I want to just give you my perspective as a voter, because I live in Portland, Maine. I've been voting in these ranked choice voting elections since 2018. And I can just tell you that really unequivocally, it's been a real disaster here in Maine for the voters, for candidates who are seeking political office, and of course, for election officials who are administering these elections. So just to give you the committee a little perspective nationally, what's happening with ranked choice voting. Last year, there were a record-breaking 74 bills that were filed on ranked choice voting by proponents. But lawmakers across the country have been wisely rejecting it. So since 2022, Florida, Tennessee, Idaho, Montana, and South Dakota have all banned it, both for statewide and also preempted local jurisdictions from adopting it. Just last week, the Georgia Senate advanced a very similar bill with bipartisan support. And Missouri, South Carolina, Ohio, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Louisiana, and Utah have all recently introduced similar legislation. And in 2020, Massachusetts voters overwhelmingly went to the polls to vote down a referendum to adopt ranked choice voting. And back-to-back Democratic governors in California have vetoed ranked choice voting bills, citing the complexity of the process. So I just want to tell you, what's the problem with ranked choice voting and why is it being rejected all over the country? Well, the first issue is that ranked choice voting requires legitimate ballots to be thrown out. And I say that again, legitimate ballots in every ranked choice voting election are actually thrown out. So how does this happen? Under a ranked choice voting system, voters are required to vote for all the candidates in a race, ranking them on 1 ballot in order to make sure that their ballot is actually counted. So when a candidate doesn't receive more than 50% of the first round of tabulation, some voters' ballots are thrown out. So If a voter decides to select only one candidate on their ballot, either as their first choice or all choices, that ballot may be thrown out, started. And this is not a hypothetical. I want to tell you here in Maine that in 2018, our 2nd congressional district, it was the first time it was ever used, the system at the federal level. Over 8,000 Mainers had their ballots tossed out. It was almost 5% of the total ballots cast in that race. And just think about that. Those are people who showed up, who voted, and their ballots were thrown out and they didn't even know it. Alaska, the other state, as I mentioned, who uses ranked choice voting, they experienced very similar results in their 2022 special election. This was to fill the seat of the late Congressman Don Young. 15,000 ballots were thrown out. And in New York City's 2021 Democratic mayoral primary, there were 140,000 ballots discarded. That was almost 15% of the total population. Another big issue with ranked choice voting is it delays results. So because it requires the central counting of ballots, it frequently delays results, sometimes days, weeks, or even months. And I want to just give you an example. In 2022, you may have heard about this race. This was in Alameda County, California. A ranked choice voting software error was discovered 2 months after the election. And it turned out that the 3rd place finisher had actually won that election. And in the mayoral primary I was referencing in New York City, it was thrown into chaos because after a week of counting, 11 rounds of tabulations, 135,000 test ballots were discovered that they'd been included by mistake, and it took almost a month to declare the winner of that race. So ranked choice voting, if you're thinking, boy, this sounds like a really complicated process, you'd be right. And I just want to point you to, in my written testimony, I submitted an example of a ballot. So if the members of this committee have actually never seen what a ranked choice voting ballot looks like, I urge you to take a look at the attached example. So this was the Minneapolis mayoral race. Back in 2013, there were 40,000 possible combinations of candidates. And just consider that. The voters in your district, vulnerable voters like the elderly, we deal with this in Maine, they're forced to vote on ballots that look like that. They're also given an ultimatum. Vote for candidates that you may oppose, vote for candidates that you just dislike, or risk having your ballot tossed aside. And so for those of you who hold elective office, just think about that. You would actually have to vote for your opponent in your race under ranked choice voting in order to make sure that your ballot will count. And just finally, I want to say ranked choice voting results routinely in winners losing and losers winning. So here in Maine, in that congressional race I talked about in 2018, the candidate who had the most votes, he was almost ahead by a percentage point. He didn't reach 50%. It went into ranked choice. The opponent won. So they're the winner under a traditional election. But because he didn't, ranked choice voting kicked in, his opponent won that race. And where I live in Portland, we had a local race, and this is true, 4%, somebody with 4% of the vote after the first round of tabulation ended up winning that race. And I can tell you, as a voter, results like these do not inspire confidence. So I think we can all agree that every vote should count, and any voting system that throws out votes by design should be banned. Frankly, it's un-American, it's undemocratic. I may urge you to protect the voters in Kansas by explicitly rejecting this voting system. Protect them from the nightmare that we've experienced here in Maine, and support SB 368. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madeline. And committee, we will open for questions at the end of the other oral proponent here, who has about, 8 minutes left. We've got, and by the way, on the S drive, committee, is the example of a ranked choice voting ballot. If you'd like to take a look at that, or in the committee website, you can get to it as well. Up next, we have Jason Sneed, who's the Executive Director of Honest Elections Project. Jason is also on WebEx. Jason, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we sure do, and you've got about 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It is wonderful to be able to testify today, and I appreciate the opportunity. My name is Jason Sneed. I am the Executive Director of the Honest Elections Project. We are a national organization which is dedicated to free and fair elections for all Americans. I also have the privilege of being a co-chair of the National Stop RCV Coalition, which brings together more than 24 organizations committed to stopping the spread of ranked choice voting in the name of preserving free and fair elections. As the head of a nonprofit, I can't specifically endorse legislation, but I can warn you about the dangers posed related to ranked choice voting. And to be blunt, ranked choice voting makes voting harder and it puts public confidence in elections in jeopardy. Ranked choice voting often has many names. It has been called Final Five or instant runoff voting, but no matter what the branding might be, ranked choice voting has a common goal: to do away with the American tradition of one person, one vote, and instead to ask voters to rank numerous candidates for each office by order of preference. RCV then computes winners through a series of elimination rounds. If no candidate wins a majority of the first place vote, the candidate with the fewest first place votes is eliminated, and ballots that are cast for that candidate are then redistributed based on each voter's next highest pick. This process then repeats until a single candidate emerges with a majority of the remaining votes. Ranked choice voting makes every stage of the voting process more complicated, so much so that enormous effort must be put into re-educating the public. New York City spent $15 million to teach people how to vote in a ranked choice election, while Maine was forced to produce a 19-page guide for voters. And this does not include the costs associated with retraining elections officials and possibly purchasing new voting equipment if your current voting machines are not able to handle ranked choice elections. All of this process, this voting process, takes more time than voters are accustomed to. Each voter must study the platforms of numerous candidates for every office in a ranked choice election, including fringe and unelectable candidates. Then they must decide which of those candidates they are going to rank and the order they are going to rank them for every RCV race on a ballot. One MIT study found that ranking 5 candidates adds a full minute per race. On a ballot with a dozen or more ranked choice elections, voting times could easily double. That would risk long lines at the polls, voter fatigue in down ballot races, and potentially deter people from participating in elections altogether. Tabulating votes is also a challenge. With ranked choice elections, tabulation cannot even begin until every ballot is received, meaning delayed results. Recounts only compound this issue. Candidates looking for an edge may demand recounts not just of the final results, but of elimination rounds along the way, knowing that they can upend the final results of the election by changing the order that candidates are eliminated in. In other words, ranked choice voting increases the likelihood of post-election challenges, recounts, and litigation. Another significant issue is the problem of so-called exhausted ballots. That is, if voters do not rank every available candidate and their choices are eliminated before a final winner is computed, their ballots are eliminated as well. With each round of elimination, it appears as though fewer people have voted. For example, roughly 140,000 ballots were exhausted in New York City's mayoral race in 2021, while roughly 11,000 were exhausted in Alaska's 2022 special congressional election. Eliminating exhausted ballots is the only way ranked choice voting can deliver on the signature promise to deliver candidates with majority support. But with RCV, this majority is merely a manufactured mirage. They eliminate ballots and redistribute votes. Again, consider the Alaska special election. If those 11,000 exhausted ballots are added back into the vote totals for that race, Congresswoman Mary Peltola's margin shrinks from a 51.5% majority to a 48.4% plurality. This is not the only area where ranked choice voting falls short of its promise. One 2023 study by the Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota concluded that ranked choice voting failed to reduce political polarization, increase diversity among elected officials, increase voter turnout, or decrease negative campaigning. In fact, one study of RCV in Maine found that, quote, negative spending increased significantly, casting doubt on the claim that RCV makes campaigns more civil. Many places that try ranked choice voting repeal it. Proponents tout a Utah RCV pilot program that recruited 24 participants at its height, yet over half of those have withdrawn, citing public confusion and RCV's failure to deliver on its promises. 5 states have banned ranked choice voting. Alaska is on the verge of repealing ranked choice voting, and numerous other states, including Georgia, Oklahoma, Arizona, Wisconsin, and more, have ranked choice bans that are working through the legislative process right now. The push for ranked choice voting is not an organic, bottom-up movement led by local activists. It is a concerted national campaign by a small group of elite donors and activists to remake elections across the nation. They are funding local advocacy groups, hiring lobbyists, facilitating media coverage, and spending tens of millions of dollars on campaigns and ballot measures to reshape elections. Americans want elections with clear rules that deliver clear winners. RCV offers neither of these things. Ranked choice voting simply makes voting harder and turns elections into a complicated black box. With that in mind, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the risks and dangers of ranked choice voting, and I'm happy to answer any questions from the committee if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Committee, any questions for either of our conferees? Senator Holscher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have two questions, actually. Jason, can you share with me where you were based?
I'm based in Washington, D.C.
Okay. And then have you been a part of any of the elections in Kansas, overseeing any, or a volunteer?
No, I have not. We are a national organization that brings expertise from across the country on election issues. So even though I haven't been involved in Kansas, we have been heavily involved in numerous states, excuse me, and we are able to see the way that elections have either succeeded or failed in other states. So we like to try to bring some of that context to states to try to help you all out as you work through election issues like this.
Okay, thank you. I actually have a question for Marissa, if I may.
Marissa? Okay, Marissa. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Marissa, I can't see you, but I'm taking it that you're there. So thank you for joining us.
Madeline, Marissa.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Madeline Marissa. Okay, sorry about that.
Melissa.
Okay. My question is, it sounds like you are very concerned with the possibility of legitimate ballots being thrown out. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yes, it's not. Yes, and I would say it's not the possibility. It's what we're living here in Maine.
Okay. All right. I just asked that because I believe you are also the same group who support the bill to take away the 3-day grace period, which does throw out legitimate ballots.
Are you speaking to the cure period and having a receipt on election day?
I'm talking about the 3-day grace period that we have here.
Yes, Senator, I would say that ballots should be received on election day.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, committee? And the 3-day grace period just only allows for the ballots to be received on election day. It doesn't throw out ballots. It just allows, we just start the curing process. Any other questions, committee? Seeing none. And by the way, Madeline, congratulations. Good luck on your child. Hope everything's okay.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Up there in Maine. All righty. Committee, we do have 8 other written proponents in your testimony. We also have neutral oral proponents, and Clay Barker's up first, and then Sage, not sure how to pronounce that, but we'll get to it here in a second. And we'll give you guys a few minutes here to testify. Clay?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clay Barker, General Counsel for the Kansas Secretary of State. And the Secretary's position, because this is a structural change to elections, what the bill, or not so much a change, but it involves the structure of elections. He's neutral, but he's supportive of the bill. So my testimony will tend to lean that way. You've already heard the explanation about what ranked choice voting is. First of all, in Kansas, since the 1860s, right after the Civil War, a statute was adopted, 25702, which is still on the books, that says all elections for any officer must be by plurality vote. That means most votes wins, and it's over, not majority. Unless the legislature expressly provides otherwise, and Senator Straub, to answer your question, the precinct leader replacement statute 253902 expressly says majority vote, but if you read it, it says take a vote, and if no one's got the majority, then re-vote. So it's saying instant runoff. You've got all the precinct leaders in one room. It's doable. And both the Secretary of State and the Attorney General have issued opinions that it would take legislative action for any form of voting other than plurality voting to occur anywhere in Kansas. And we've never seen that. So then the question should become, why pass this bill if Kansas already mandates plurality voting? And there's 2 reasons. One is, as you can tell, some of our election law is older, and the language is applied to new technology, other new laws, getting it all coordinated. And even though the people that run elections and the attorneys may have a view of what a law means, and it's consistently been applied for decades, occasionally a court, a lawyer, a county attorney, a lawyer, another agency, activist reading the law for the first time will come up with very different interpretations of it. And so we feel it's good practice to be very clear and precise in what is allowed and not allowed. And second, it was brought up the city home rule power. I actually get all the charter ordinances when cities exempt themselves from state law. I've never seen an election one, but it's possible a city could try to exempt itself from that statute, even though the counties who run the elections don't actually have the ability to implement it. And as stated before, I believe 2 states have adopted this and about 50+ cities around the country. And those cities either adopt it because they run their own elections, and Kansas counties run elections, and some state cities do, or sometimes a state like Utah passed a law that allowed cities to do pilot programs, so it was expressly provided. And briefly, the reasons why we see from the administration side of elections about why ranked choice voting would not be a good idea. Well, one, there's not a lot of widespread support for it. I get a lot of fan mail about elections, and very rarely do people talk about ranked choice voting. Second, it makes the system much more complex, which means that there's higher chance of errors in the administration of the election, and you've heard a few examples, and it can affect the public's perception of the election. They may not understand what's being done, and the problem of ballot exhaustion has come up, where someone just doesn't rank all the voters, and they, in essence, lose their ability to influence the election as it goes to second, third, fourth tier. And third is the cost. You'd need new infrastructure, new software, new ballot design, rewrite the laws on election auditing, perhaps on recounts. There'd be a lot of infrastructure changes that would come along with this, training. And a piece that I hadn't put in my testimony, written testimony that occurred last night, talking to some people that run elections, I said, if this were to be adopted in an election, what would your general strategy or advice be to your candidate? And the response was uniformly, the candidate would go cardboard neutral to try to appeal to the most people, avoid taking principled stands, and alternately go scorched earth negative on the opponents to push them down the ranked choice. So to sum up our position is ranked choice voting is something that sounds great in theory, very difficult to implement. I wouldn't quite call it a train wreck, but it's difficult.
Thank you.
Stand for questions at any time, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, let me hear from our other neutral oral opponent, and then we'll open the questions for the neutrals. Sage for Mirza? Yes. Is that close?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Sage Pormirza. I'm a staff attorney with the League of Kansas Municipalities. Thank you for the opportunity today to present neutral testimony. So we understand the goals of this legislation from a cost perspective. It obviously has been mentioned how costly implementing ranked choice voting can be, and also the concerns with voter fatigue and simplifying the process for voters. At the same time, as an organization, we oppose any legislation that impacts a city's constitutional home rule authority. So that's why we're here today presenting neutral testimony on that. I just want to be clear, we're not aware of any city that currently has any plans to implement ranked choice voting or anything like that. So this isn't a concern that we see from a city standpoint with anyone trying to implement this. I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Sage. Committee, I'm going to open it up to either Clay or Sage for any questions that you may have. Senator Faust-Godot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Clay. Thank you, Sage. Clay, do you know of any states where a ranked choice voting was implemented and it worked well?
As the previous testimony, I believe Maine and Alaska have done it at state level. I really couldn't give you an opinion whether it worked well or not. They ended up with a winner. They may have had internal problems that I'm just not aware of.
Okay. Any other questions, committee? Clay, I have one. With regard to the local control issue, does not the legislature still have constitutional authority over setting election policy?
I believe so, Mr. Chair. I hope so.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in the limits of what home rule authority gives cities versus the legislative authority, but this makes it clear that this is a law of uniform applicability to every election in Kansas.
And with regard to your written testimony, the uniformity issue is a big deal from Secretary of State's standpoint. I mean, if you started having these popping up in small municipalities here and there, it seems to me that that's a big concern.
Oh, absolutely, Mr. Chair. Is just we have to work with 105 counties, and we want uniform policies as much as possible in all of them, and not one county doing something different. It would just cause a lot of administrative issues and raise costs.
And we hear people all the time trying to change election law, the national popular vote, all sorts of different ideas. So, I mean, you always have to defend what we do right now, I think, so.
Yes, Mr. Chair, and again, that's why the Secretary is supportive of this bill. I wish they were like a different category than proponent neutral sometimes, but.
We'll work on that. Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you. Up next, we will have our oral opponents, and again, we'll set the clock for 15 minutes and then have questions after that time period. We'll go in order, and up first, we have Gilbert Moore, who's a private citizen. Gilbert, we'll start the clock now, sir.
Thank you. There are a lot of things I heard today that are very surprising to me. I've been involved with ranked choice voting, pushing for it for 2 years when I heard about it, and I literally talk to people every day. I make it a point, and you probably will not find anybody like me. Every day I talk to somebody on average. And so I have a general idea what the public thinks. And I mean, everybody I talk to, once it's explained well, and sometimes with other election improvements, they like it. And I'll give you a couple reasons why, but there are several things that were spoken here by the opposition are not correct. And I'm going to address those. Otherwise, they'll be missed. And I'm going to address those first and then leave my other comments about things, because I don't want to miss this. There has not been billions of dollars pushed to put ranked choice voting in place. We're lucky to have millions, actually. I mean, billions in recent year or so. The idea that ranked choice voting is complicated is baffling to me. We use computers to do this. All of Europe uses it. Australia uses it. Maine's been using it. And nobody's complaining about throwing out ballots. And when somebody says there's 4-5% of ballots been thrown out, how many were thrown out before ranked choice voting was implemented? That's my first question. Also, the idea that we're only talking about a couple states having ranked choice voting just blows my mind. In the last November, 4 major cities adopted ranked choice voting. And they did that after many cities in California have already had it year after year. They've been adding city after city after city after city. In cities that they can't use ranked choice voting because of the machines, they do another type of voting which is very similar called approval voting. In the state of Kansas, you have 15% of the machines that will not handle ranked choice voting. But in those cases, you can use approval voting. St. Louis uses approval voting. So does Fargo, North Dakota. The idea that with exhausted ballot, there's misconception. You do not have to vote, rank every person on the ticket. That is absolutely false. Now, there may be a few places that said they had to. The idea that you have to, I guess this concept comes from the idea that if you don't rank everybody, then you'll be left out of the process. And here's what this has to do with. If I'm a person and I choose to rank 3 out of 5 people, let's say, I'm going to back it up to 2. I like 2 people, and if they don't get it, I really don't care what happens with the rest of the voting. When a person doesn't vote all the candidates on the ticket, what they are saying basically, if my 2 or 3 people don't get it, then I'm going to leave it up to the rest of the voters. And they have a right to do that. This is something I never hear anybody talk about. Also, if you have a situation where the Secretary of State doesn't get people off the ballot who have decided not to run, you have an issue with zombie voters. And in those cases, everybody who votes for that zombie voter, their ticket's tossed out. With ranked choice voting, that would not happen. If I chose a person who's no longer on the ticket as my first choice, the ranked choice voting would automatically have me allotted to the person that is my second choice. The benefits of ranked choice voting are what people want in our country. This is why they do it. I'm going to go back to another issue. This idea that ranked choice voting is being thrown out of places that use it already is not true. The problem is that parties that don't want to have to compete as much for their elections don't like it what happened to them in the last election. Right after ranked choice voting was done in Alaska, immediately the losers got up and said, we got to get rid of this. And what happened was the people of Alaska said, no, we're keeping it. This has happened. This is the way it's going to be because people love it. The idea that the comment that Alaskans hate it is not true. There's going to be an attempt every day, I mean, every year from now on, there's always going to be an attempt to get rid of ranked choice voting because it's challenging to the people that run. They have to work harder. They got more, they have more competition, something they never had before. Alaska had 41 or 42 people run in their special election. The Alaskans loved it, and they got to pick somebody who would have never made it otherwise. This system that we have right now, where we just have one person from one party running, another person from another party running, another person from another party, is not what people want in the United States. We have two parties in our country that compose approximately 25 to 27% of the electorate, and 40-some that aren't, who don't care for the two parties. Those people want ranked choice voting. Every one of them do. They want more selections of people. When you have ranked choice voting, this allows people to get into politics that normally would not make it. In the race in Georgia, where we had to select the senators for the last race, we did not have ranked choice voting there. There was a libertarian that took 8% of the vote, and two senators, neither one of them got over 50%. We're talking about costs now. If they had ranked choice voting there instantly, that would have been done. The people who voted for the Libertarians would have had their votes allocated to the other two candidates, and the race would have been over.
Gilbert, you've used about 6 minutes, and we still have some other oral opponents.
Okay.
So I want to
Thank you.
be considerate of their ability.
You're doing very well. I appreciate
Thank you, sir.
it.
Appreciate it very much. Up next, we have Davis Hammett from Loud Light.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Really quick before I get in this, I do want to mention a specific example in Kansas that might lend you to take a more nuanced approach to this, which is that in the 2018 Republican primary, you might recall when Steve Watkins won the primary with only 26% of the vote because it was such a crowded field. So he wins with 26% of the vote. He goes on to win the general election. If y'all can recall all the scandals and the headache, I believe it was for the Republican Party around that candidacy, and then he was gone. But he got in there with only 26% of the vote. The last three governor's elections in Kansas, the winning candidate has not gotten 50% of the vote. And so the idea of plurality versus an actual majority, actual 50% plus one of the people who voted to support you is really what this debate is about. But I think whenever we zero in on this, because we're not actually debating if the state should go to ranked choice voting. This is not a bill about ranked choice voting or adopting it. It's a bill banning something that does not happen, which is a sort of bizarre position to be in because, again, nowhere in the state does this happen. There's arguments that it could or could not even legally happen today, yet we're talking about banning something that doesn't happen. In 2017, the legislature had a bipartisan joint interim committee that studied this. And after a full day's testimony with way more information and way more expertise than could possibly be presented here today, their conclusion was to not do anything. They saw a lot of benefits to it. They recognized that local governments might be able to implement it, and also some of the technological limitations that we had. And they just said the best thing for the legislature to do is to just not do anything. So I would say if y'all do choose to pass this, you're going against a bipartisan interim committee's recommendation. This is more broadly a sort of big government encroachment on local communities' self-determination and home rule. And really, for all of those reasons, this is really not accomplishing anything, and it's sort of distracting from a more important conversation we could be having about, do we have the best system that actually is putting people in office that the most constituents support? So with that, we oppose this bill and do not, frankly, know why it's being introduced and heard, but I'm happy to stand for questions when appropriate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All righty. Thank you, Davis. We have the rest of these are on WebEx. We have Seal King from the League of Women Voters. Seal, are you online there?
I am online. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Right. I think Davis and the others have already covered most of my points. We at the national level, should first introduce myself. Seal King, I'm with the League of Women Voters of Kansas. And at a national level, our National League has determined that ranked choice voting is sustainable and advisable and most representative of the people's wishes. And that by using ranked choice voting, people do have more chance to be represented in their voting choices, just as Davis was going over. There are numerous states that already use it. Some, I think 6 states use it for overseas voters, which would be the military, in allowing them ranked choice voting in case of a tie or needing a runoff. And we've already heard about many other states using it in different capacities in their municipalities, local elections. So the league is for the choice of ranked choice voting. And we ask that you say no to this bill and don't ban it in Kansas. Allow this to take its natural progression as technology advances and this education becomes more prevalent, that we have more people educated in what ranked choice voting actually offers. So thank you for your chance, and I'll stand for questions if needed.
Thank you, Seal. Up next, we have Elaine Steffen, also a private citizen, also on WebEx. And Elaine, we're up to about 11 minutes, so you've got about 4 minutes left.
Okay, and I know we have some other proponents, so I will be very fast. Hi, I'm Elaine Steffen. I am a conservative independent constituent for Senator Blasey. I ask you to ban this bill. I also happen to be, although I'm not speaking as, the leader of Rank the Vote Kansas, and am able to answer questions you have about ranked choice voting, our group in Kansas, and how much support there is in Kansas for ranked choice voting. One of the main reasons that I ask you to oppose this is the idea of majority rules, minority rights. The last 2 gubernatorial races have been won with less than a majority, and the votes for independent and libertarian candidates exceeded the number of points between the top 2 candidates. As far as the exhausted ballot question, exhausted ballots are essentially just candidates or just voters who did not vote for one of the top 2 vote getters. And we see that if you look at Alaska's last 4 statewide elections before implementing ranked choice voting, the number of ballots that were not for one of the top 2 candidates exceeded the number after ranked choice voting was implemented. As far as ranked choice voting hurting Republicans, I've heard that concern. If you look at Australia, the right-wing side of their politics has been part of the governing coalition 68 out of the 110 years since ranked choice voting was implemented in Australia. I know that our other proponents can speak more articulately than I am, so I will leave it at that. I ask that you oppose SB 368, and I stand for questions when appropriate.
Thank you, Elaine. Richard Pund is up next, and Richard, we're down to about 2 minutes. And Richard's on WebEx. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Richard Pund. I'm an Overland Park resident, and I oppose SB 368. I actually believe that the state should go in the opposite direction and explicitly allow ranked choice in our elections at local, state, and federal level. I won't try to repeat everything that everyone else said, but hearing the conversation at the beginning, how we have runoff elections now for appointments, that kind of shows my point that ranking candidates is something that we naturally do already. You know, we have our first choice and we might vote for them in the primary. If they make it to the general, we keep our first choice on the ballot, we vote for them again. If they don't make it, we go to our second choice candidate and vote for them in the general. This is something that we do naturally. Again, all voters do this, and ranked choice voting is just a faster and more efficient way to express that opinion in our elections. As some of the others said, ranked choice guarantees that the winner gets a majority of the vote. And I want to be cautious about moving the goalposts of what we call an exhausted ballot. Right now, we call them undervotes, and we have lots of undervotes in our elections now. In a close race with plurality, even though the winning percentage might be over 50%, we're not counting the undervotes in that. And so even with two candidates, we might have less than 50 in that case. I wonder if I'm not sure if there are other people who are going to be talking in opposition, so I'll just leave it to that, and I'll be here if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Richard. We're basically out of time for that group, so Larry Bradley, Chris Saxman, Josh Daniels were supposed to testify orally. WebEx, I apologize to you three since the 15 minutes is up. We also have 8 other written opponents, committee, in your testimony package. Also, it's on the S drive. I'll open it up now to questions for the oral opponents. And do anyone have questions, committee? Senator Blasey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions for Mr. Hammett. So you mentioned that the governor had not been elected in the last 2 elections by a majority vote. And so I guess my question would be, would you then support a runoff election to ensure that someone gets 51?
So it's an interesting question that we actually explored in the House Elections Committee last year. The issue with runoff elections is there is a massive reduction in turnout. And so if the goal is to have the candidate supported by the most people in the state, runoff elections actually don't do that because you do have a huge drop-off in turnout during runoffs, which we see, in Louisiana and Georgia. So that's why, this system where essentially, and we're not even saying that we support this, right? Again, this is not really a discussion about if we are adopting ranked choice voting or if it's the best. It's just if the state should prematurely ban and try to shut down the discussion. But essentially what this does is it's the idea of allowing people to rank their, second or third choice so that it's better known as an instant runoff election so that you can have as many voters voting and not deal with the logistics of, a runoff election in December with massive reduced turnout. And then you have a situation where a governor ends up winning who got way less votes than their opponent in the previous November election.
So I know voter disfranchisement is something you're passionate about and work on. So what would your response be to the 140,000 New York Democratic primary voters whose ballots were thrown out?
So I think on that phrase, like thrown out, right? I think I would need to look more into Opportunity Solutions projects research on that. And I think, as was mentioned, that they're maybe talking about exhausting a ballot where, you ranked your first, second, third, all of them didn't win. And so your vote, it went to your second, still that person in the next round didn't get it. It went to your third, still that person didn't get it until you have no votes left. And as was said, we have an, it's called, I think, like an undercount. Essentially, whenever people fill out their ballot in Kansas today, you don't have to vote for every single race. Some people skip a race. They don't like that race, or they don't feel like they know enough about the election, which tends to happen in maybe a school board race and things like that. So we already have undercounted votes. Now, undercounting a specific or exhausting your votes on a specific race is very different than throwing out or uncounting an entire ballot, which I think was to what Senator Holscher had mentioned, where when we talk about the 3-day grace period, the question is if these people just will not have the right to have any of their votes for the various selections counted. This is about maybe exhausting or undercounting a specific race on your ballot, not throwing out ballots.
But I think that's the point. If you're a voter who's just very passionate and supports just one candidate and only one candidate, and you go cast your vote, we want to ensure that voter knows their vote's going to be counted and not be exhausted down the road, because there's multiple rounds per se. And I think the voters of Massachusetts clearly saw the dangers of that and rejected it in 2020. And the California governors, as you know, are Democratic, have opposed it. This is an issue that isn't partisan by any nature. It's just there's concern that there's voter confusion. There's concern that voters are going to be, their votes are going to be exhausted and not counted. And so ultimately that harms democracy. And I think that's why there's a lot of concern about, and we see a lot of states all across this nation reacting to what's happened in Maine and Alaska, where it's currently in practice, statewide.
Yeah, and as I would say, and thank you, again, we're not debating if the state is adopting this, right? We're debating, essentially this bill is about if in local communities in Kansas, if the state will prohibit them from having this discussion, being able to decide, hey, maybe we want to do our local school board races differently, and even consider, I didn't have time to look into this enough before, but Johnson County even has some unusual methods about, for example, their board of trustees, where you sort of like, I forget exactly the details, but you select a couple candidates and the candidates that get the most out of that. There are some unusual systems that are not just select one candidate for this race that already take place today. And those are, I think, important discussions for local communities to have.
And this bill doesn't affect those practices. I mean, a lot of small towns in particular, like the small town I grew up in, you select 3 council members because there's 3 seats. And so there's going to be 3 winners on election night. And so this bill does not touch that in any way. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Senator Holscher?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Oh, sorry, that wasn't on. Yeah, my question is actually probably for Mr. Moore. I believe you mentioned that several other cities have just adopted ranked choice voting. Other areas seem to express that they like it. So why do you think this is being brought forward here? Why would Kansas want to stop this potentially when we're not?
In the cities you're talking about?
I'm sorry. I think you mentioned that 4 major cities just adopted ranked choice voting and that there is.
That's just in California.
Okay, and that there is an appreciation for it as far as the process of voting. So I guess my question then is, why do you think this bill is being brought forward in Kansas?
Well, it's very obvious. Very obvious. It's all states that don't like the idea of losing, their party losing in Alaska, are all doing the exact same thing. It's a preemptive strike against ranked choice voting. That's what this is. Before voters even know what it is, bills are being introduced to get rid of it. This is an overreach, clearly. Exactly nothing less. So, until everybody knows what it is, it shouldn't even be brought up. It shouldn't even be discussed. Right now, what's going on in Alaska is stellar. I mean, the people love it. And in Nevada, they've already voted on ranked choice voting. They're waiting to vote on it again. Ranked choice voting and open primaries, a second measure, it's very good. And they have to approve it twice in Congress to get a state amendment, I'm really having trouble here, but to get a constitutional amendment in Nevada, you have to vote on it twice. And they've already voted on it once, and they'll vote again in November. And if they do that, they'll be just like Alaska. Maine already had ranked choice voting, but they didn't have nonpartisan primaries. They've adopted it. Tennessee voted for it, and the legislature in Tennessee was afraid of it, so here's what they did. A year ago, November, there was a ballot initiative to get ranked choice voting on, and it passed. The legislators chose not to do it for whatever reason, because they didn't want it. And in the House following November, on February
This is not testimony time. This is answering questions time.
I'm answering your question. She asked me why are people not
running on
doing it.
2 or 3 minutes here, so.
Okay, I'll shorten
Be
this up.
concise.
The legislators drafted a constitutional amendment to get rid of ranked choice voting, even though the people had voted for it just a few months earlier, in March. They changed their constitution before the judge could get out his ruling. So there is a battle going on, for and against. And the ones that don't want it are clearly just not wanting to have to compete. That's really what it is.
Any other questions, committee? Thank you. Do you have one, Senator Blasey?
I guess just one quick comment to response to Mr. Moore. You know, it was mentioned earlier by, I think by Elaine, that the governor had not been elected by a majority vote as well. And she's kind of arguing that ranked choice voting would actually help Republicans win the gubernatorial election, because you had libertarians and you had an independent candidate who ran from the right. And so hypothetically, I think that contradicts your comment about what you just said about Alaska and the majority party there.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, but I'll tell you this. Ranked choice voting doesn't give an edge to anybody. It just gives a clearer picture of what people want. Meaning, if you got 5, and I'll give you an example where there's some confusion about how it works. And this is where you folks are going to have to study. If you had a 2-person race, I'm just going to use Republican and Democrat. Republican and Democrat, 1 person would win. Suppose, we'll just say the Republican had 65% of the vote, hypothetically. But in that race, there were 4 Republicans. If you put that same race, put the same 2 people on there and add 3 Republicans to it, or 4, the fear would be, oh my God, we're going to split the vote, we're going to lose. The beauty of ranked choice voting is that won't happen. And it could be that in that first round, with these candidates on the Republican Party, one of those people could have more votes than the winner. But when you take that person and you put that person in a race with that person, the right person would win. You got to understand the mechanics of this. When you split, there is no spoiler effect with ranked choice voting. And a party can run several candidates just to even see what the people want. And it won't hurt the winner at all.
I think he made my point, which is ranked choice voting would have helped Derek Schmidt. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're out of time. We're going to close the hearing on Senate Bill 368. There are 2 more bill introductions coming down the line. I've got Senator Fascadeau, I think, had one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The RS number is 2782. And what this bill would do, it would create a insurance program for the purchase of new homes. It's called the Helpers Act for police, firemen, educators, et cetera, for those responders that are helping us all out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, any questions or objections to introduction? Seeing none, that bill is introduced. I have one. It's RS, I believe it's 2828, Jason, is that not correct? And that is on foreign land acquisitions. Committee, any questions or objections to introduction to that bill? Seeing none, that is introduced. That is all for today, committee. We do not have any meetings tomorrow. We might work bills on Monday. Thank you all for coming and testifying today. We appreciate that. I think it was a good debate.